I'm a hydraulic engineer for the Iowa DOT.
I'm Oswald with Iowa Homeland Security, working in flood risk management.
Pam Cook, City Des Moines Engineering.
John Joyner, City of Ames.
Larry Kirsten, I just saw the notice in the newspaper.
Jeff Zog, I'm with NOAA National Weather Service out of Des Moines.
Mark Heiser with you, Upper Mississippi Inland Reserve Owners Association.
John Sankson, City of Bedford. Steve Eggles, City of Bedford Housing Group.
Kevin Richards, USGS, Iowa Water Science Center.
And why don't we go back?
Don Beal, Homebuilder, Iowa. Denny Lundberg, Corps of Engineers, Breakout.
I'm Ralph Rosenberg. I'm director of a statewide environmental nonprofit called the Iowa Environmental Council. I also live in a home that's been flooded in the past.
Great. Thank you all for coming to this breakout session. As I just want to reiterate, I know that Sam and Roy mentioned, I'm going to just be taking just some quick notes. It's not going to be recorded or anything that's going to be used. Anything that you really want to be heard, I really encourage you to fill out those comment sheets that you received. So before we start, I'm just going to provide a brief recap of sort of what the framing questions are going to be for the day. And then we're just going to move into a brainstorming session. However makes the most sense, I guess we'll just kind of take the temperature on that, I suppose, just kind of popcorn, whoever has comments. There are going to be some agency support staff floating around to help answer questions. I don't know, do we have any of the agency support staff? Okay, you're the agency support staff, wonderful. So, and what was your name again? Andy, that's right. So Andy will be here to answer any of the, kind of easier questions, but anything that you want to easy questions. But anything that you want to see changed on the implementation guidelines, any of those really specific recommendations, or any of the really hard-hitting questions, we really just would like you to jot those down. Okay, that being said, so let me just do a little recap. So the focus of this group is on the implementing guidelines for using best available, actionable hydrologic and hydraulic data and methods that integrate current and future changes in flooding based on climate science. That means federal actions in coastal hazard areas should consider tools like NOAA's global mean sea level rise scenarios in conjunction with global relative sea level rise conditions before moving forward. For areas at risk from flooding from rivers, federal action should account for changes in riverine conditions due to current and future changes in climate and other factors, such as land use, by applying state-of-the-art science in a manner appropriate to the relative risk of flooding in that area. So, if you want me to reread any more, I'm happy to. I was not able to memorize it beforehand, I apologize. So if anybody has anything specific, which is a brainstorming session, any questions, comments,
What proportion of the country for federal projects is there already the data for the climate-informed science?
And I can speak to this region a little better than nationwide. We do have several counties and communities that are using future conditions, and they're actually publishing them on the website. These would be a 1% plus floodplain. Looking at, and they're printed on the map as a future condition based on potential economic growth, potential building growth, possible upstream development, that kind of thing. As far as a percentage, I don't know.
Will the states or federal government determine what is actionable?
can you repeat that last part?
Will the states or federal government determine what is actionable science, climate science?
Who decides?
Well,
That's the man.
And I think that's one of the things we need to develop is how that's going to be determined. And that's kind of what this process is for, is developing what you think potentially should be the way we do that.
I have a very specific question. So, for example, when we build interstate highways, I-35 coming out, if that has to be built in the near future, is it, who determines what the flood elevation that is needed to be? Is it the federal side that determines it, or is it the state side that determines it? To protect that from flood problems.
And traditionally, it's been the federal.
And I'm sure.
Because when we look at federal programs, FEMA is a consulting agency. We are not a regulatory agency when it comes to 11988. So in this case, it would be very similar. It would be other agencies developing what they were going to do to control that flood. That's the other kind of thing that we're looking at. We're looking at suggestions. What do you think should be done in that kind of a situation? Should it be state? Should it be federal? Who should be doing it?
Right now, most states and counties, owners dictate really what they design to. The only time, and you guys come into play is if you're in an FI. So, you know, and then we're just stuck with the no rise issue and deal with that. But like what I was thinking was, then if the state's pretty much assess risk, design these roads and bridges. My feeling would be that that should stay the same with guidance from the federal government.
And that's kind of how it's written is guidance. Given the fact that we're also looking at a federal highway, not a state highway. We're talking about I-35.
Correct.
4 years ago, the Corps of Engineers issued their flow frequency report in the city of Des Moines for the Des Moines River. Has had pretty significant impacts on the work that we've been doing in Des Moines. For the last 4 years, we've been trying to go through that maze of regulations with the Corps and with FEMA. We'd like to build something in the next couple of years. I don't see this process resolving itself in the next couple of years. What do we do? What do we build to what we currently believe is the best information in the 100-year plus 3 foot for freeboard for FEMA accreditation? Or do we build to the 500? Or do we build 100 plus 3 plus 3?
And those are great questions. And that's
And they have
until we
very
have-
different
yes.
price tags.
Exactly. And until we have implementation guidelines that we don't have.
And we don't have a timeline for that
We
either.
don't have a timeline. And that's why we're going through this process, is to try to develop those implementation guidelines, which is much support and input from local communities to tell us, this is what we need, this is why we need it.
So we've spent 4 years responding to a report, and now we need to put everything on hold while all the implementation guidelines get worked out, to then again do
I don't
additional
know that this
studies.
is saying that.
Okay.
I think this is saying that there's going to be an implementation date. When we figure out the implementation guidelines, there's going to be a date. And that date will then be, these guidelines must be met starting on this date.
Starting on that date.
And so
But you're going to have some kind of, it's only going to be for planning stages. You can't jump in the middle of project development and say, okay, now redesign everything.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly. Exactly. So
So you're using the best science today.
Proceed forward.
You're not going to be
We got the
asked
money in the bank,
to
keep going.
hit the redo
Okay.
button and start
Well,
over.
Yeah.
You know what situation we're in, so
Well, I know,
that's-
I know.
But no, it's not intended to be retroactive. to
Okay.
where you have to start over. That's not the intent.
I'll go even a step further on that. On the FEMA side, we emphatically set the effective date of the policy. If the project has been obligated, it has been obligated. We don't reach back. That said, many of the things we're talking about here are clearly consistent with what FEMA could do today. And to the degree that people are trying to meet some of these standards, really what this does to FEMA is go from what we could do to what we must consistently do. So we have on the public assistance side our 406 mitigation and other kinds of elements where we can build higher and stronger. But it is far more of a discretionary action today. So to the degree you're attempting to do it, I think there's ways to walk with folks.
Okay.
But I don't imagine retroactive applications.
FEMA was intending to start a mapping project in Polk County early this year. Is that still the plan?
But let me go farther, regardless of the answer to that question, it does not change the FEMA map. The FEMA map maps the special flood hazard area, which is the 1% annual
And
chance.
so accreditation, if we get our accreditation,
Nothing changes for FEMA's,
Okay.
a few more emphatic pieces for you. Nothing changes in FEMA's levee regs, those are already plus 3 foot. There's no additional impact on that. And FEMA's map itself is the base flood elevation.
Okay.
This says what you layer on top of it if you're using federal dollars for construction. But it's all predicated on ensuring that there's consistency in how FEMA's applying its maps, because this layer gets put on the map. It will not change your map.
It may change what the Corps wants us to build to, though.
I'll let the Corps speak to the specifics of
Okay.
what that is, but frankly, the Corps, may have someone in this group, has long been in a process dealing with risk and uncertainty and other kinds of elements that often look much higher than FEMA's
Absolutely.
standards. So I don't think that it would have, it shouldn't change your reality.
I think that's right. And we haven't seen implementation guidelines either, so we have.
I know, that's my fear.
We don't really have a clue what's gonna come out of it.
Yep.
So in your comments, I mean, you guys have started to say a couple of ways that you feel like, the 1% plus floodplain, that's one way that this information could get injected into it. Are you looking for us to comment on other ways that climate information can get pulled into it, or other
Absolutely. So
communities that
under
have
this
done experiments?
option, the standard simply says use the best actionable climate-informed science. Some have suggested that we should be clearer about what you should look for when you're implementing it. And I've heard people on both sides of that. You absolutely. So I would point you very specifically in implementing guidelines to lines 780 and following, where we explicitly call out actionable science. And the interpretation is in the paragraph that follows. And if you keep reading farther down that page into the 800s, you see the definition of the plus 2 foot and the 500. Those are the words that interpret it. You may have ideas here today, you may have ideas afterwards by which you have ways that you think we should do that. That's absolutely what we're all here.
I'm not an engineer like a number of people around. It would be helpful to me to understand this if I had some idea of the different outcomes if you use the climate data versus a arbitrary freeboard versus a 500-year flood. Are we way off, or do we come out about a level plane using those three options?
Basically, we don't have all three in one location potentially. And so this is giving options of, if you don't have climate data, maybe you look at the 500-year floodplain. If you don't have a 500-year floodplain, maybe you look at best available climate data. It's giving, there are three options that can be used for those federal monies. It's not saying you will use climate data. It's giving those options, but it's how we implement that. And that's kind of what we're trying to figure out is the best way to implement it.
If your project crosses the number of agencies, all of which choose a different method,
And that's true nationwide.
give me some sense, or us some sense of what happens.
And I don't, basically, I would guess we'd look to the lead agency to determine the way they would consider the best methodology to do for that given project. But I don't know that. Maybe that's something that could be written out and say,
Yeah.
we need to know that.
That would be a very nice thing to clarify.
Yeah, and you should definitely write those.
No, this is a multi-year department.
And we'll say that
A multi-year department.
In fact, that situation, if you write that down, that would be perfect, because that is going to be something that's a real world
Nothing
situation.
that impacts what we would pay out in terms of the floodplain.
In the slides, you mentioned when you used the term federal dollars more than once. This applies to federal projects with federal dollars. In your slide, it says applying the standard, you use the term agency grant programs and not any grants to fund construction. Would it be safe to assume that that would also extend to guarantees and insurance, federal insurance?
And that I don't.
I guess I should make that more of a declarative statement rather than a question.
But in terms of whether or
Because
not.
is HUD and FHA insure single-family homes for builders? And that's probably going to, some of this is going to apply. Same when we insure multifamily projects. And that is an insurance RD, rural development also guarantees single-family, multifamily, plus some community facilities. And I would imagine that will also take effect. And again, those are not grants. I'm just being persnickety because you just used the word grant. When you say federal funds, I think that takes the whole envelope.
Right, and I think that was specific FEMA from our HGMP grants and some of that kind of thing, where when the slide was written, we were focused at FEMA. But yes, it's federal dollars being spent on big projects.
Federal programs, yes. Thank you.
I would like to pick up just one thing, this gentleman's comment. That I have the same concern that you do. If you have tentacles, I could even make an argument that if the GSEs, as Fannie and Freddie, if they have a backing of the loan, if it goes bad, federal money goes into it.
Now, I will
Does
tell you
that
that
affect
we should be exploring with you how to.
And it's not intended to. This is basically an amendment to 11988, which is for federal projects going with federal funding. And that's why it was kind of written. Yes, there are offshoots. I don't know what the impact's going to be on those. I don't feel that's the intention of this ruling. But you're right, potentially it could be.
We would feel more comfortable if we were specifically omitted, and not just omitted by silence on what's included, but actually, this is what it doesn't.
Just one last thing.
Doesn't include.
If there was a.
I think
Just one second. So I think these kinds of comments too, and definitely needs more clarification. So what exactly, what needs more clarifying within the implementation guidelines in terms of this?
I'll do it, because I know exactly what he's saying.
Okay.
We'll get it down to the details so that you can understand.
Thank you. Did you have another comment?
Nope.
Okay.
We took care of it just there.
Okay. How about some more comments about what did you guys see within the implementation guidelines that you wanted to talk more about or see changes or have more clarification on? Worries, concerns?
And this one's tough because this one is best available data. So it's data that could be developed over time. It could be existing. It could be future generation flood mapping. It could be NOAA's new stuff. It could be, I mean, all of this can be pulled in and used as best available data. And we do that even with flood maps. We'll take best available data for NFIP, insurance and that kind of thing. So these are things that we want to get a really good handle on for implementation. And so that's what we're asking is anything you guys can come up with for implementation that would help with developing how we would go about making the ruling of this is what we anticipate, this is what we'd like to see, this is how we'd like to see it submitted. That's kind of the meat of what we're trying to get into.
I'm going to try to understand. Broadly speaking, these are all voluntary. And
They are, yes, they're all three choices if you're in that situation.
so then, tell me what an affected landowner or government entity would do to enforce standards that aren't met. That because they weren't met, they were adversely impacted. What gives teeth to these standards if they're all voluntary?
Well, in a lot of cases, it's the fact that it's federal dollars that are being used.
So, but the federal dollars have been spent.
And so we could then recall that potentially and say, you owe the federal government this amount of money because you did not follow this guideline.
Which, in reality,
I agree.
that's not going to happen.
I agree.
But, so, can you put something and say, all right, we know you messed up this time, but you're not going to get federal dollars again? That's going to catch people's attention. If these standards are really going to mean something, how are you going to enforce them? Or carrot and stick, not even regulations, just carrot and stick stuff.
And that would be a great comment to have as well, because enforcement is a concern that we aren't sure how we're going to be able to enforce.
We have cost share and conservation compliance in some of the ag area, crop insurance. You can expand that with existing flood insurance.
You know, we don't. I think it's important to note, that's a great point. It's important to note that as soon as FEMA's done, then the federal agencies that are on the screen and are all responsible to take the next step. So we have to do comment period also. The bottom line is if we're going to insure 300 units of multifamily product, they have to show us those maps that they're producing before we will sign off and guarantee or insure that loan to that bank. So that rural development has the same thing. I know SBA has the same thing. So there are within each department those stopgaps that you're talking about. Those will occur after they're done with their business April 6th and we get these done. Then we start our business. And it's already there, it's just we have to apply it to this problem. And we do take money back.
Thanks.
Yeah, since 2008, Iowa has experienced nearly $2 billion in federal funds through FEMA in disasters, public assistance, and hazard mitigation grant program. And I think that this really will impact the public assistance program, which will add resiliency to the recovery process with roads and bridges. You know, worked a lot with DOT on this, as well as public buildings, other infrastructure, wastewater treatment plants, other utilities. So I think there is that issue there, because many times it was noted in the opening is that we do see repetitive damages. And I think that if we're going to invest in recovery, let's not do it, recover in the same way that we found it, but make it more resilient and stronger, and elevate or relocate.
And again, I don't want to talk too much, but actually the state of Iowa has an outstanding, they need a kudos. Homeland Security Emergency Management is doing that under their own auspices without FEMA money in Northwest Iowa on individual assistance and with housing. They have their own recovery housing task force to take care of that very thing. And this state's already recognized how important that is, how they can make that happen.
So, this is a funny group for me to be in, I think, because there's a lot of people here who understand federal programs a lot better than I do, I think. And what I'm struggling with is, I guess, as just a citizen, I don't really understand when there was a bullet up there that talked about these guidelines will not affect National Flood Insurance Program eligibility. I guess was what I gathered from it. But hazard mitigation grant program sounds like it will be affected. Is that right?
Oh, I think it will be, as well as the public assistance program, which is recovery, which can add resiliency. For example, Hilton Coliseum, was flooded here a few times, and they did add some flood barriers, and the University of Iowa got hit pretty bad. University of Iowa, Coralville, Iowa City, they've done tens of $millions worth of mitigation, recognizing that they are in danger. And they want to test their flood walls on an annual basis, but they test them because they have to put them up. And so we recognize that, they recognize that. But one of the things that we are working on in Homeland Security is the effort is, what can we do to reduce peak flows? And so what we look at is, our standard is that we repair what is already there, but can we reduce peak events? And those are the things that we're looking at, going up into the watershed and reducing that and working within the agricultural community. So instead of, and I don't mean this, instead of putting a Band-Aid on it, let's go up and work on what's the issue.
And my follow-up to that is, okay, so if these are floodplain analyses that have to be done and incorporated into your hazard grant mitigation program applications or whatever procedures, then what about the other side? When they perform the cost-benefit analysis to determine if your mitigation project should be funded, will these be added into that cost-benefit analysis? Because I know for a fact the Hilton situation, they weren't allowed to go as high as they wanted to go because the cost-benefit analysis didn't cost out based upon
Current flood discharge relationship.
Exactly. So I think that's, I don't know where to put that in all of these guidelines. There's what, 800 lines? Is that what that guy said? 800 lines?
That's what he
20 was
actually.
It's just that big.
That's the Reader's Digest.
Sorry, you guys, Evan's okay over there having a hard time hearing. I'm wondering if you guys could just, everyone do one big scoot inward, and then we can just talk closer to each other.
No, we appreciate that y'all are talking.
Yes, we just talking.
So Tom, you think that these new regs or standards would implement your hazard mitigation programs?
Well, I'm looking more at public assistance.
Public assistance.
I think that the 406 mitigation is probably going to be utilized more often.
Yes.
Would be my
In
guess.
fact, I think
That's
the
more
intention.
public domain stuff, not your
Yeah.
private residence. Okay,
Right,
gotcha.
yes.
But how that's implemented still yet to be determined.
Yeah.
So is there still confusion there? And maybe that's something that you, I mean, I'm sure you're probably commenting on is and you maybe you can help me out here, is what the difference is of, what's going to be affected.
Basically, how is the private citizen going to be affected
Right.
versus a public entity that's doing a project?
Right.
And 11988 is based on federal projects as opposed to individual projects getting federal funding. And it is kind of vague. And so that it would be a great comment to put down when they're talking about implementation of defining what kind of projects that it's actually going to be applying for.
And it sounds like there's some kind of ambiguity there too. If any kind of federal dollars are going into anything, how that's affected.
Absolutely. Is it a federal project, or is it any federal dollars being applied towards any project? Well, traditionally, it was not that way for an individual receiving assistance. This is talking more for a federal project using federal money and a federal situation, which is what 11988 covers, is federal agencies doing federal projects.
This is where this gentleman's question that we need to go into big time detail, because right now FHA is saying once this is kicked in, FHA insurance is going to be looking at this.
Right. For individuals.
For individuals, not just the federal or the state or local governments.
And that's
So that's the question here, is what's so important, how far are those tentacles going to reach?
exactly. And that's a great thing to be capturing, because we do need to define that and have that in our implementation.
Filter all the way down to community development block grant projects.
Oh, without a doubt, yeah. And he mentioned GSEs, which are government-sponsored entities. We don't need to go on all that now, but they're not really technically government money, but who knows? Well, that's a good question.
And that's what we need to define in our implementation, is where, how are these going to be applied?
All the way down to the detail of what happens, the house is damaged, substantially damaged, so it gets FEMA to rebuild that house. They are to flood protect that in its rebuilt state. So it goes from the old map, 1 foot above.
Yeah, flood protector, what?
Well, but
the old map now it has to be.
Individuals would be 1 foot above the current, and if I be 120 plus the current.
They will have to meet their current ordinance
They're not going to be
if they're
subject
more
to
than
this federal.
50% damage.
Well, That's why I'm bringing it up, because it sounds like because that's FEMA federal money, they used to, pay for the rebuilding of the church.
That's where where Andy's talking about, you gotta separate federal money from federal projects. Right. That's the difference.
If it's simply to pay out of a flood insurance claim, there's not a change beyond what the local ordinance requires. If they get a grant dollar to subsidize that, the higher and stronger elements could kick in. But it's that federal grant dollar inserted in.
So we went to we had that discussion where we expanded the term grant to loans, guarantees, et cetera. And so that's
And while you can speak more definitively on the HUD side than I can, it's the point by which the construction is taking place. And so I watched this play out in a number of post-event pieces. If you haven't hit the 50% threshold at all, so you're not reconstructing something, you're simply repairing it, these standards don't have an impact. If you are going to do that substantial improvement, it's 50% of the value, or it's new construction, it would apply.
That's the point I was bringing up right there. Then that person reconstructing more than 50% damage would need to meet the new standard. Is that what you just said, or not?
Let me separate person from entity. So I think that's where helping us, even in your comments, differentiate these various pieces. To the degree that you are, very few of your loans actually are for new construction. You do have a small set of them that are. So if it's for new construction, this applies. There's no other way to look at it, it applies. But the other kinds of things, refinancing, all those things, doesn't change the reality on the ground. From an FHA perspective, but if you're using CDBG to build something new, this will apply.
Even for an individual homeowner that had flood insurance, that was substantially damaged, needs to rebuild, instead of 1 foot above the 100, now he's got to be 2 foot or at the 500.
So we can go offline on this. I think we need to look at the specifics of what you're talking about and where their funds are coming from. Because if they have flood insurance, they're getting almost, if not all, their money as a flood insurance claim, and this standard does not apply to a flood insurance claim.
If they're getting something else to help reconstruct it, it could.
So we're getting really short on time. I just want to really quickly wrap this up. I know there's a lot of scenarios that we can go over.
One more question though.
Yes.
Because we have HUD and we have Army Corps and we have Homeland Security here. This was about climate science data and methods. As you currently do your work, what climate science and data do you use? I mean, how would new climate science be reflected in what you use? It sounds like the 100-year flood is one really important thing.
There are people at headquarters, this is the biggest pun here all day. People at headquarters are a heck of a lot smarter than I am. Let the guys in policy and research figure out what the map is, what the data and science. Even if they told me to do it. So there's a pun.
Great question. Capturing your notes as well. And so we are moving into different breakout sessions. If anybody would like to make a comment during our public comment time, take a speaker card and fill it out.